there's got to be a way, and I know you've done videos about this, but I'll just say there's got to be a way to both love your ancestors and also be honest about their sins.
Yeah.
There's got to be a way to do that. And right now it seems like we can only do one or the other.
That's actually a function of idolatry. It's an image of idolatry, because one of the things that happens is that because we don't have the fractal relationship, because we don't have this hierarchy that leads all the way up to God, we actually expect of these lower rungs to be perfect. And if they're not perfect, we hate them because they're not perfect. And so there's a sense in which if things were properly laid out and we don't treat these figures as idols to worship them or to cast them down, either way, that we see them as just manifestations that are gray because they're not God. All these leaders, all these heroes have dark sides. Obviously, there's no way around that.
Right, yeah.
Then we could celebrate their heroism and also recognize their sins. This is Jonathan Pedro. Welcome to the Symbolic World. Hello, everyone. I am very excited, as usual, to be here with Richard Rohlin for the continuation of our Universal History series. This time, we're actually going to look at the idea of national epics and the way in which different nations would tell their own story. How, in some ways, they try to pop out and to have their own particular vision, but then also how that ultimately still fits into the idea of universal history. So I'm excited to go along with this. So, Richard, it's good for you to be here.
Thank you. Before we get started, I will say more about this at the end because it is cleverly related to our topic today. But graceful segues abound in today's episode. But I have a Kickstarter going. It should basically already be live when this video drops, or within a day or two. So there'll be a link down below. It's to a tabletop role-playing game called Emboria, Role-Playing in the World Under Starlight. If you want to know what the World Under Starlight is and why we're doing it as a role-playing game and not some other medium, I'm going to answer those questions at the end of the video. It's funny, when Jonathan, when you posted we shared the Kickstarter, like the landing page, like a couple of people in the comments, like on YouTube or whatever, were like, Christian shouldn't be, blah, blah,
role-playing game, playing games and all Dungeons and Dragons is satanic.
I know, yeah, right. Well, so anyway, I'm going to talk about actually very soon I'll be doing a video with Father Deacon Nicholas Kotar where we'll be talking about that question specifically. But I'll say more about that project at the end because it's kind of related to the topic of today's video. But yeah, so part of the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I have recently met a bunch of like symbolic world folks in the wild, sometimes unexpectedly. Usually they just show up at my church. Shout out to Samuel, if you're listening, Samuel, who came to Vespers on Wednesday night and is like, "Wait, what are you doing here?" Well, this is my church. What are you doing here? But no, it was great. So I've been talking to some people who are kind of new to the symbolic world and the universal history train. And so I thought it would be useful because we've been doing these videos for almost 2 years now, I think.
Crazy.
Maybe actually 2 years. I'm not even sure anymore.
Amazing.
We've been doing them for a while. So I thought it might be useful to revisit a little bit and maybe kind of put in some new terminology, what we mean by universal history. Because one of the things that I've noticed in my conversations with people online and in person is that sometimes people sort of get a little confused about what we mean by medieval universal history and will mistake it for things that look similar, but maybe have completely different goals. So that's where we're going to start.
Go for it.
So the symbolic medieval universal history is, let's say, sorry, I'm looking down at my notes. It's a combination of what let's call the Christian mythic content. And by mythic, obviously, I think everybody should know by now, I do not mean false, right? But Christian mythic content in the sense that it's a myth that we live into, a sacred story, etc. So there's a Christian mythic content, which is obviously the Bible. It's also the Apocrypha, by which I mean the actual Apocrypha, not the director's cut of the Bible. And then it's also like the lives of the saints, and then all the squiggly folklore traditions, weird stuff, dog-headed saints and the head of St. John the Baptist flying around haunting people. We were just talking about before the recording started, like stuff like that, like all that stuff that's kind of out there more on the margins of the tradition. That's all kind of part of this Christian mythic content.
Yeah.
So it's that plus the mythical content of Greece and Rome, and specifically the great classical epics, the Homeric epics and the Aeneid, like if you want to really drill down to the core of that.
Yeah. And there's a little bit of foray into more local mythic traditions, I'd say like Scandinavian traditions, but the Greek and Roman mythological always ends up being connected in some way, even to those Scandinavian traditions.
Yeah, so I'll get to the more local stuff here in just a sec, because that's the next part of this, right? So, but this stuff together, right, becomes the I've been thinking about it like in terms of hierarchy, but it's almost like when you hear me say a hierarchy in this instance, it is better to understand it as like a series of like nesting dolls, rather than like something that's really top heavy and like an upside down pyramid or something like that, right? So
and it's a fractal, like it's the best example of a fractal. It's like little identities exist in larger identities and connect, vertically up to into the biblical narrative, you could say.
Right. And so this container of the Christian mythical content plus Greco-Roman civilization's mythical content, the container of those two things together becomes a container which is like large enough and sort of robust enough to then contain this multi-tiered hierarchical identity within it. So this is so identity in the ancient world, unlike the way most of us think about identity today, talk more about that later, is it's hierarchical. That is, it's conveyed from the top down or from the outside in, right? If you're thinking about nesting dolls, and it begins with God and it ends with me. So you have God, right? And then you have the sort of like the almost parallel streams. And I realize there's a whole very long running historical debate about who has priority, the Pope or the Emperor or whatever. Or if you're in the East, you've got the Patriarch and the Emperor. But in any case, you've got God, and then you've got the Pope or the Patriarch and the Emperor. And then down from there, you have these various increasingly localized principalities. So if we're talking about the church, then you've got under the Patriarch, you've got like, there's the holy, there's your local bishop, and then under your local bishop, there's the priest that he's basically deputized to act on his behalf, like all the way down to you. And then if you're talking about that on a national level, I mean, it's not for nothing that the original like diocesan structure of the, like a diocese is a Roman imperial like division of geography and people. Like, so like the original like metropolitan diocesan structure of the church in the early centuries was basically, they just used what the Roman Empire kind of already had in place, right? So that you would have these increasingly local nested identities that are basically parallel.
Yeah, so it's important because, when a lot of modern historians, when they notice the gestures, for example, that some local, what they would call a warlord, makes towards the emperor, who is like so far away and they have nothing to do with, they tend to dismiss that as just irrelevant and just words. But if you understand the way that people saw identity, then you can see that no, this gesture is very relevant to how they anchor everything together and make everything make sense in their world.
Yes. So in the way that worked for like worldly power structures or ecclesiastical power structures, it also works for stories. So at the top or the outside, you have this. And the other thing to say about that social ecclesiastical hierarchy is that there are holy people. A good example would be like your local patron saint, right? Holy people sort of exist outside or kind of bridge the hierarchy in unexpected ways. So if you live in a small medieval village in Central Europe or something like this, you've got the emperor and the patriarch and everything way up here, way up above you. But then like, there's also your local patron saint. Maybe it's Saint Nicholas, right? So like, if things are really getting out of hand, so you have a path of like appeal, let's say, right? You can go to Saint Nicholas, and he can go around. I mean, he can go around the Pope or the Patriarch or the Emperor or whatever, and to kind of like help you out in your situation. So you've got holy people, and of course the problem with The problem with modern people trying to understand this is we all want to be the person who's outside the hierarchy, right? And it doesn't, but it's really just the holy people. And when I say holy, really hear that not just in a sense of this is a good person or a nice person, but that in the sense that this person is sanctified or set apart, because there's also such a sort of a thing as, let's say, the secular holy person, which I'll come back to in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So anyway, secular in the holy person in the sense that somebody's like a secular, but they're set apart, and because they're set apart, they're also sort of operating outside the normal hierarchy of things.
Yeah.
So
it's in some ways there are ways in which the hierarchies, these are, how can I say it, like in terms of a system, it's like fail safes in the hierarchy.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the way to. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but it's a good way for people to understand why the hierarchies are never, even when we talk about hierarchy, they're never just this simple top-down thing. They have a kind of variability and ways to shortcut when things go wrong along the hierarchy itself.
Actually, so before we started the recording, we were talking about the Arthurian stories a little bit, and the knight errant is a good example of that kind of a person in that sort of story, right? Because they have this role that puts them outside the normal hierarchy. So they show up in like a baron's district, and the baron is evil and he's awful and he's oppressing people. And it's like, well, where's the king? Why doesn't the king know about what's going on? But actually, the knight errant, he has a pipeline to the king, right? So he's here from the round table. He's here from the king's court, and he sets things right, and then he goes back, right? He goes back to the court when it's over. So anyway, that's an example of that kind of thing. So if this is true for, like, you could say social, ecclesiastical hierarchies, it's also true for the hierarchy of stories when we're talking about universal history. So we start with this kind of one grand foundational story, which is sort of mythic, the mythic content of Christianity plus Rome, right? That's the ground foundational story into which you have these increasingly localized identity conferring patterns. The story of, well, now here's the story of my people when we converted. And then beyond that, you might have, here's the story of my city or my village. And then beyond that, you have like, here's my family history, all the way down to, this is how my parents raised me. And all of that stuff. And of course, what I'm really describing is the idea of tradition. Yeah. Right. All of that stuff confers identity at all these different levels, but it has the capability to kind of each of those levels to be nested. And obviously, there are certainly places that converted. I mean, this is why we actually kind of started the series with Ethiopia, right? Is because there are places that converted that were outside the Roman Empire. So in that case, they're actually like the best proof case for like how this works, because it's not like they had any like political, they had
no political reason to play this game at all. Right. Or the Armenians in the same way.
Another great example.
They had no reason, because people always say that it's just Constantine and Rome. And like, we have several case examples where that seems to not be the case.
Right. So any of these identity conferring stories can be aggregates or a pastiche. And actually, this is better. And this is another thing that to kind of point out, this is why, for purposes of what we're doing here, I'm deeply uninterested in questions like authorship. Yeah. Doesn't actually matter, right? And the reason it doesn't matter is because certain kinds of things, not everything, but certain kinds of things actually have more authority when either we don't know who wrote them or made them, or when the person who wrote or made them has become a mythic person in some way, right? So to give some examples of this, actually, a really good example of this is the divine liturgy and the divine services in the Orthodox Church. Yeah. Right? There was no committee that at any point in time sat down and said, here's the way we're going to do things. And there's not a regulatory body across all the Orthodox churches in the world that says, all right, everybody, we're making this change to liturgy this year, right? It's not how it works. You can dig down into the history, and I've done this, and there are lots of people out there who've done this. You can dig down into the history and figure out, oh, this part appeared here, or this prayer maybe came from Saint John of Damascus, or but even then, that's a saint, that's a holy person, that somebody who's become a mythic person, right? But it's actually because it wasn't just created by committee that it has the kind of the weight and the authority and the sense that
you can't just do whatever you want with it,
Yeah.
right? You
And
have
that
to
it comes down from heaven is a good
right.
way.
Yeah, it comes down from heaven, right? But when we say something like that, that's what we mean. We don't mean that like the typical dropped out of the sky,
It landed on someone's head.
landed on somebody's,
That's right.
What a silly image.
Yeah.
But yeah, we don't mean that. But what we mean is that this is really it passed down through the life of the church, right?
Yeah,
as opposed to
it appears like it appears in so because it's the same with some of these icons not made with hands. People.
Yeah.
There's a way in which the idea that the icon not made with hands was never made by anybody. I understand. I want to be careful, right? It's like the idea that these icons appear, they kind of appear out of nowhere. They find them in the water. They find them somewhere and they're kind of not, they just happen. And we don't know who made them. We don't know where they come from. But there always is like material causes if you spend a lot of time to try to dig into them. But that's not how we receive them. So that's why we kind of see them as this pattern kind of descending from above and manifesting itself in the world.
That's a great example of this because there are some icons that we do believe when we say they're not made with hands, maybe what we're really saying is there's something miraculous about the creation of this icon, right? The icon not made with hands, right? The one that Christ made of himself, right? That's like the ultimate example, right? But yeah, when it comes to some of these icons, especially of the Mother of God, where this icon appears in the field, right? The cursed root icon, I think, is a good example of this. There's another icon, I can't remember the name of it now, but I got to venerate it when I was in Lithuania. It was this tiny little sort of Russian village church, and really large icon, very beautiful. And it just sort of, they found it in a field one day.
Yeah.
Where did this come from? How did it get here, right? And so it's an icon not made with hands, not because anybody there is saying nobody ever painted this or touched this, but it's just it was just received, right? It just came from heaven in that sense, right? Typically speaking, for these things, like they have to have some kind of a mythic authority, right? This is why, I mean, even all the way down on a fractal level, this is why sometimes when your parents tell you something, you won't listen. Because your parents, right? But then some other adult who you do not know as well, they tell you the same thing, and suddenly it's got cachet.
Yeah.
Right. But this is actually why
it's the Jordan Peterson clean your room. It's like, why is it that when he says it, everybody thinks it's genius?
Is a perfect example. But I mean, for instance, this is why it's actually better if you don't know what shenanigans the Pope or whatever bishop or like whatever patriarch so-and-so is up to. Like, it's better if you don't know those things, actually, because because the mythic, let's say like the mythic distance, that's actually part of the way the hierarchy is supposed to work.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, this inverts ultimately at the moment of communion when everything gets, collapsed into the single point. But just as like a normal way of operating through your life, it's better if you don't know.
And I want to say something about the hierarchy of stories too, that's important for people to understand, is that this again is one of the problems of our thinking, is that we tend to confuse quality and quantity in the way that we see things. And so when a lot of modern historians look at these original histories, they'll notice that there's, like I said, there's a gesture at the outset which says something like, we're connected to this son of Noah, or this relation to the Trojan War or whatever, and then they'll go into their national history and spend a lot of time on it. And so they'll tend to dismiss the first part and say, well, what's really important is this.
Yes.
But just because it's one sentence or one page or one paragraph doesn't mean that for the people who wrote it, it isn't primordially important to be connected in this way, that it wasn't like the reason why they even wrote their national story is based in this first little part that you dismiss and you don't think is important.
This is such an important point that you're making here, because I've had conversations with like Old Norse scholars and stuff, about what's sometimes called the Younger Edda or the Prose Edda, which is we'll get to it eventually, but it's basically, it was like this is where like most of the stories from Norse mythology probably come from this text. But the text itself is a manual for poets written by a Christian man named Snorri Sturluson, right, in the 14th century, I think, 14th, 15th, somewhere in there. Anyway, long time after paganism had already died out. And he's writing these stories down because Norse poetry requires the use of what are called kennings, which are nested references, and sometimes they go several levels down. And so if you don't know the story that's being referenced by the story that's being referenced by the story, then you won't know how to use this in your skaldic verse. And so poetry as an art form was kind of dying out. And so Snorri tries to basically gather all the old stories. And I strongly suspect when he didn't actually know the story, he just made something up that sounded good to him. But anyway, nothing against him. It's just like some of the stuff in there is, I think, a little questionable if you wanted to really convince me that a 7th century Baltic pagan actually believed like this is what they thought about Thor or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, but the point being that so he writes it for that, but then he begins it with this very actually quite a long chapter, which connects it to the Christian story and connects it to Rome, where you find out that all the Norse gods, they're actually refugees from the Trojan War, and they were actually famous men at one point and powerful wizards and all this other stuff, right? And but when I've talked to Norse scholars, like scholars of Old Norse literature about this, I'll mention something like, well, the Prose Edda, it's got these features to it, and it's actually from a Christian perspective because of this stuff, and they'll look at me like you're crazy. I'm like, well, what about the beginning though? And then they'll say, oh, well, we don't count that. That doesn't count. That's not, like that's he just had to do that so that the church wouldn't, as though nobody in Christianity like had ever told the story before, like, and so it's just I have a hard time even articulating how much this sort of thing irritates me. So yeah, those little bits, there's like the little proem at the beginning of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which connects the whole establishment of the kingdom of Britain, of which Arthur is now king, connects it to Brutus and the fall of Troy, and all of this stuff. Like that stuff was actually deeply important to understanding what the Arthurian story was even about. So much so that like that particular Brutus gives his name to some of the like early Arthurian poems, Layamon's Brut, for example. But without that context, like the story wouldn't have been the same to them. But of course, no, the stories are actually about feminism and power struggles and like all this other stuff. And so just
that's way more convincing, right?
Right. I'm actually probably just still irritated about the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight film that came out a couple of years ago. Still pretty salty about that. But anyway, okay. So the other thing to mention when we're talking about these kind of nested hierarchies of stories in which is really what I mean by medieval universal history, right? Is that folklore has the same kind of function as like your local patron saint, as folklore is something that kind of is able to jump outside or like buttress the hierarchy kind of from the outside. And so folklore will often just like bring two things together that don't really like, these two people could not have lived at the same time, or this this obviously happened here or not here, or something like that. But folklore can collapse those distinctions in a way that supports the symbolic structure of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
In the same way that your patron saint can like collapse the distance between you and the emperor or whatever. So yeah.
Well, I mean, you see that even in hagiography, right? What is it? You can do it with saints because they can kind of come back from heaven and do things. What is it?
Yeah.
Julian the apostle. Who is it? I forget that. Is it Saint Demetrius? Who's the emperor? It's like it's not during his life, right? It's like after his death.
God forgive me, I can't remember right now.
I know, me too. It's horrible. But the Saint Demetrius is shown in an icon killing a king, like killing and it's not during his life. It's like after.
I'll think of which saint it is, probably like before the end of the video. But yes, so the grand foundational story of the Christian world is the gospel. You could say, especially the story that's from Genesis to Acts, and then the apocalypse, right? But especially the grand foundational story of the Christian world is the passion and the resurrection of Christ. And this is why in traditional Christianity, there's so much emphasis placed on Holy Week or Passion Week and on Easter or Pascha. I mean, if you want to get like irrationally irritated at English language Christianity, a great book to read is a book by an English historian. I've talked about it before on the show, but an English historian named Eamon Duffy. And he wrote a bunch of great books about prayer in the Middle Ages, but he has a fantastic book called The Stripping of the Altars. And there's a long chapter in this book on basically how they celebrated Pascha or the Easter Vigil in England before the Reformation, and just like your average parish church. And it's so orthodox. Like it's so similar to the way that Orthodox Christians are used to celebrating Pascha or Easter today. And you just sort of realize, oh no, we had this at one point and it was all stripped away from us. It took me a while to get over that, to be totally honest with you, right? But so then after this, you have a wide range of stories, like we're talking about, with increasing locality, that nest the local and the specific within the universalizing and the cosmic. So in our Universal History series, we've been mainly focused on these kinds of stories. This is what we've been mainly looking at, right? How did people groups, as they converted, nest their identity within the Christian and within the Roman story, even when they themselves maybe fell outside of the empire? Just to emphasize again, before we get into the next section, is that these identities, they stack or they nest. And if you don't understand this, then you will make the mistake, which as I'm going to try to argue, is basically the mistake of 19th and 20th century nationalism, which is to create something that's very top heavy, right? Where it's more about, here's the narrative that actually has to control and oppress everything beneath it, rather than serve as a container for it.
Yeah, that's really important. And that's when you can see, I mean, in general, that's when you can see how, when any identity goes wrong, is when it doesn't respect the normal nesting of identities that are below it, right? It's like, let's say a family, a father, it's like, okay, the father is the head of the family, but the father is the head of the family in the way that is there to make his children and his wife be fruitful and succeed and be themselves, right? And have their own lives ultimately. And so that's the way that all identities should function. Now, that's the way God functions, and that's the way that all identities should function. That's why people are, when we talk about nationalism, they become very tense, because they always think that all that means is, like you said, the way that the Third Reich presented their nationalism, right, as this completely identity that takes over. But it's not just the Third Reich, right? Napoleon and a lot of modern national identity had that feature, but it was not a feature of ancient thinking.
Yeah. I think a much overlooked vision in scripture is Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, right? The one, I think it's his first one, but the one of the tree, right? So he has everybody remembers the vision of the statue being destroyed by the stone cut out of the mountain, but in his vision of the tree, right, it's the idea of the tree, and of course the tree is the king, right? The tree is this beautiful tree. It gives shade to the plants beneath it, and also the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. The wild beasts kind of gather around it. But that's what the king is supposed to be. And you could say that that's whatever your story that gives identity, that's what it is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be this tree that, the birds of the air, these various principalities, and the beasts of the field, which are, the things that are lower down, right? They can come and they can find shelter and shade and protection. And of course, in his dream, ultimately, because of his pride, the tree gets cut down. But the point is that this is what the king, or you could say the grand story, whatever it is, that's how it's supposed to function.
Yeah.
And obviously this didn't always function perfectly, but there is but it functions surprisingly well, let's just say, right? Even when you have somebody like the Pope saying, I think it's in maybe the 5th century, saying, okay, nobody in the West is allowed to read the Book of Enoch anymore, but then there were still places on the the outer branches of the West, in Scotland and Ireland and the British Isles particularly, where people kept all of these things, right? And they sort of kept them, they still remembered them, and it was still part of, again, not just a book in a monastery, but teaching from Enoch, teaching from the apocryphal books was actually a major part of parish life in Anglo-Saxon England, right? And so there was space, even when you had somebody who tried to totalize things,
in some way. There was space for this stuff to kind of fit in.
Yeah, and but one of the reasons why, that's why it's hard for us to think that way, is that because we live in a technocratic society, we confuse authority with power. Because we have the capacity now for authorities to have indefinite power, and so when the president or whatever, when the authorities say something, they can implement it completely into
all the way
world.
down. Yeah.
Whereas in an ancient world, that wasn't the case. You know, the Pope can be in Rome saying whatever he's saying, and it's going to have influence, but it's not. He doesn't have the means to enforce it all through Christendom, and so there's always this organic variability that installs itself just naturally by just normal human mechanisms.
So,
yeah,
along comes the Protestant Reformation, right? And the result of the Reformation, and it has to be remembered that the Reformation took place in Germany, right? It was primarily, in its beginning, it was primarily a German religious movement, right? Obviously, it goes to France and Switzerland and England, other places, but originally it's primarily a German religious movement, except that the Reformation didn't take place in Germany because Germany did not exist. Germany is a made-up country. Fake news, everybody. No, Germany's a made-up country, right? There, if you look at a medieval map, there's no Germany on that map. Nobody who lived in the place that we call Germany now would have called themselves Germans. Actually, they still don't call themselves Germans. But a really fun game is actually what's the name of German in other languages, and like I don't know, what do you guys call it in French?
Allemand.
Yeah, right. Because like the Alamein region, right? Right. So it's nobody who lived there called themselves Germans, right? This German, but Germany is a modern construct.
Yeah.
But the way that it was built, the story sort of begins in the Protestant Reformation. I don't have like a ton of time to go into this, but let's say that as a result of the Protestant Reformation, we got something called the 30 Years' War in Western Europe, which is one of the bloodiest periods in Western Europe. Actually, not the Middle Ages, right? But this is now in the modern period. 30 Years' War, incredibly bloody struggle between Roman Catholics and Protestants over basically a very small slice of Western Europe.
Yeah.
And the end result of the 30 Years' War is something called the Treaty of Westphalia. And one of the things that comes about as a result of that treaty is that they decide, okay, your religion will be determined simply by whatever principality you live in. So like if you live in this little province, and some of these are quite small, basically the size of what in Texas would be a county. I don't know, do you guys call them parishes or counties, or like what's the unit in Canada beyond the city?
Yeah, we do have something like that. I forget what they're called. Yeah,
okay.
We have Conti, yeah.
Yeah, county. Yeah. So but basically these very small principalities, and your religion, if you lived there, would just be whatever the religion of. And so what happened was that instead of the identity conferred by the Christian story being kind of at the very outside level, is that it collapsed down actually several levels into the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it goes from being, here's a universalizing story of Passion Week and Pascha, right? Of Rome and Greece, of the Trojan War and, St. John the Baptist, right? All these things, like this is our universalizing story that kind of is the container that holds everything together. And now that collapses actually several rungs down the ladder, right? To now it's actually secondary to your political identity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once you kind of understand when that happened and how that happened, you can then understand how it's actually a pretty short trip to go from there to now my religious identity or my spiritual identity or whatever is something that I confer upon myself.
Yeah, it's
now.
Personal thing.
Right. Yeah. But also but isn't that also like political identity also has collapsed down to that level now?
Yeah.
So you can freely associate with whatever political party you want, at least in some parts of the world. But talking to the United States, you can freely associate with whatever political party you want, and everything about your identity has collapsed down to the level of the self. So
When all of this is going on, though, and before it kind of gets all the way down to that level, primarily in the 18th and the 19th century Europe, you have the emerging of what is sometimes called the search for the national epic.
Yeah.
So why do we need the national epic? Because we're not part of an empire anymore, Holy Roman or otherwise. We're not part of an empire anymore. And we're not even part of the same religion anymore. Right? And listen, nowadays, Protestants, Roman Catholics, Orthodox, like we can go out together and we can have a beer and we can talk about our differences and all these different things. Nobody stabs anybody. And that's great. I love that. Don't get me wrong. But if you think for a moment that somebody, in the 30 Years' War believed that, the Roman Catholic over there and me, we're the same religion, basically, and we're just quibbling over a few small differences, like this is not how people thought.
Yeah.
They weren't killing each other over small differences, let's say. So anyway, so you're not held together by the same religion anymore, and you're not held together by the same and you're not even held together by like the sort of like the imperial story, right? And so now what we need to do is to try to find some other narrative that can collect and hold our identity together. And this is why there's the search for the national epic.
Mm-hmm.
So something a lot of people don't know. You're of course aware of Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, the brothers Grimm, right? And they're famous for a bunch of fairy tales, which they did not write. The fairy tales that we know as like the fairy tales of the brothers Grimm, they were edited mainly by Wilhelm, but they didn't write those stories.
Yeah.
What they did was they went around collecting all the oldest stories, like the children's stories is what they would have called them. But they went around just like correcting all the old wives' stories and all the old children's stories and things like this from these tiny little idiosyncratic, valleys in different places in what is now Germany. And they're collecting these stories because the oldest stories preserve the oldest words.
Mm-hmm.
And Jakob Grimm is a philologist. He's interested in really old words. And so his two great works that he composed were the largest and most comprehensive dictionary of the German language which has ever been created, and then also an accompanying volume. Sometimes it's called Teutonic mythology or German mythology or something like that. It's got its own name in German, which I won't try to pronounce here since we're on the internet. But anyway, you've got these two massive volumes. One is This is the German Language, and the other is This is German Mythology. And they're both fascinating works. His Teutonic mythology is, let's say, has a lot of problems from the perspective of modern scholarship, because once again, there were a bunch of gaps and he just tried to fill the gaps in by guesswork, essentially. But the fairy tales were, basically he was sending his grad students out because grad students are the mindless minions of the academic world. So he would send his grad students out to basically collect these stories, and then later they edited them together in a volume. And that turned out to be much more popular and let's say more enduring than the other two works.
Yeah.
But what a lot of people don't know is that following the German Revolution, sometimes it's called the March Revolution, when the National Assembly of the German people, is like the first German parliament, was what came together. Jakob Grimm had a seat. It wasn't just a seat in the parliament, but it was like a special chair.
Oh, really?
And he had a vote and everything else, and he got disenchanted with politics. It didn't really last. But the reason that they gave him this spot in the very first German parliament ever was because he was the great German philologist. He was the great German, you could say, storyteller, in that he was telling, by collecting all these old stories and trying to package them and arrange them, what he's actually doing is creating an identity that is German, an identity that's based in the language that you speak and who your ancestors were, more than it is in what your religion is or where you live or those other things. And so one of the great questions at the time was, well, as the German state is being founded, and there's lots of like little revolutions and different governing bodies and all these different things. It's difficult to track even if you have it all laid out in front of you. But basically, one of the big questions that they're trying to answer is, what does it actually mean to be German? Right? It's not a religious question anymore.
Yeah.
Right? It's not, so like, what does it mean to be German? And obviously, eventually, attempts to answer that question are going to develop in some really kind of unhealthy ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In more nationalistic ways, the way we understand them now. Whereas
right.
in the ancient world,
Right.
if there had been some kind of German identity, let's say in France, there was definitely more of a basic French identity, even though all the regions there was still that issue where all the region, and like your French identity was basically that, you're somehow related to the King of France. Like that's where your French identity comes from. You owe allegiance to the king, but then you probably don't speak French. You don't speak the same French that the King of France does. You speak some other local dialect or whatever, and you don't see that this allegiance to the King of France as this totalizing thing, right? As this thing that it's like, I am French, in the way even that the French would understand that today.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about nationalism as opposed to, let's say, the older mode, is that your national identity is now much more totalizing, to the point that it has the ability to actually obliterate the things beneath it.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah, well, the French is a good example. When Napoleon took over, he basically, imposed Parisian French on the rest of France, right, to make it one language. He basically imposed an education system onto all the different regions, and those that and you can see that all, like during the revolution, you can see that happening. It's wild. The local places that resist the revolution, they get slaughtered. I mean, people just get slaughtered because there's this one thing, nation, right? That's where even the idea is kind of born, right? This idea of a citizen of a nation, the way that we understand it now.
Yeah, and it's a sort of a weird extension, you could say, of like the really old classical idea of the city state.
Yeah.
But now imposed across many cities and over a very large geographic area, until you get to these places where you have the situation today where modern nation states are so impossibly large. I mean, this is part of why I keep demurring on like when we're going to do like what's the symbolism of America video, right? Part of it is that like which America?
Yeah.
Like,
well, don't you think that one of the reasons for the success of America has been that it had been, at least for a while, had been able to kind of recast that multiplicity, right? A sense in which there were local traditions, local places, people in different regions just have different ways of living, and we kind of don't feel like the centralized authority has the right or the capacity to impose ways of being, ways of thinking on the people in the local areas.
Yes, there is a I think that was part of a lot of the early genius of the American project, and the two things that really challenged it and maybe broke it. Although we'll see, we're a brand new country, so we'll see. But one is the creation of the interstate highway system.
Yeah,
the ability, which is very importantly, it's like now it's the artery, right? The arterial system that connects the country, but very importantly, like it's owned and paid for by the centralized power, the federal government, right? But then also along with that, kind of developing, as well as there's something in our Constitution called the Interstate Commerce Clause, which basically gives the federal government authority to regulate anything that might possibly touch interstate commerce. And I don't want to get like too much into like American constitutional stuff and politics, but you could just say that the kind of the brilliance of the great localized being able to recast that locality, like you just said, that started to break down when those two things, and obviously airplanes have made things worse, but anyway.
But it's interesting because here in Canada we can really see where that leads to, is that it actually leads to extremes in some ways. Here in Canada we're seeing the other extreme where, as we know, as the federal government becomes more powerful, it's creating this sense that diversity, only diversity, like we don't have an identity. This has been now the way that the the government is framing it is that Canada is a nationless nation, right? It's a post-national nation. Our only value is openness, like our only identity is diversity. And so it's almost this like weird collapse, like this.
I like how you guys took the joke about Canadians being hyper apologetic for everything and just like, what if we turn that into an identity?
Like, what if we turn that into our own identity? And it's interesting because in Quebec, we have a weird fractal thing about that, which is that in Quebec, they're trying to hold on to their identity, but they really think of it in terms of nation, like really in terms of the French project, in terms of nation. And so it's all collapsing because they're trying to like impose language and impose identity over Quebec, but they don't feel it. It's not an organic thing. And so as they're like, we have this massive immigration policy, we're including all these people, but they have to learn French and they have to kind of fit into this weird thing. It's like, well, it's all not working. Like there's something so inorganic about that. In let's say in the Roman Empire, you would have had, let's say, groups of barbarians that would come and maybe settle, and they would negotiate with the local person, and they would let them settle. They would keep their identity, but they would also pay homage to the Romans, but it would be a way more organic, natural way, but it's almost impossible to do now.
Yeah. So
we thought we would get into politics so much.
I know. Well, I mean, it's my own fault for picking the subject, right? Because it's like it is kind of, especially as you get closer and closer to modern times, it becomes more and more inherently political. So you have as the old idea of the empire, Holy Roman or otherwise, right? As the old idea of the empire recedes, as Christianity as a central unifying story, as that gets pushed more and more to the back burner, let's say, as a result of the Enlightenment project and everything else, something has to step into that space to fill the void that says, like, well, okay, how do I know I'm finished, right? How do I, like, what does it mean to be finished? Like, Finland has been part of the, talking about the 19th century now, right? So Finland's been part of the Russian Empire for a long time, right? But like, nobody in Finland speaks like the same language the Tsar speaks and everything. So like, what would a Finnish identity, what would that look like?
Yeah.
Right. And so they're trying to figure that out and answer that question. And because so much of the Enlightenment project looked back at a very, how do I say, literally a very monochrome version of the classical period, right? I say literally monochrome because they go over to Greece or Rome or whatever, and they see, here's all these beautiful old white marble pillars and temples and things like this, and so they assume, oh, everything must have been like this, and it's so clean and it's so orderly and all this different stuff. And then for many decades, like whenever evidence would emerge that this statue or that these pillars had been painted, like, I mean, we've gone to church with Greeks. Like, you can't tell me those people
didn't paint those statues.
Come on, right? But whenever evidence like this would surface, they would destroy it.
Yeah,
because it destroyed this sort of pristine, monochrome, hyper-ordered vision that they had kind of created out of the classical period. In reality, it's nothing like that. But that's the vision that they kind of created for themselves. And I think it was so appealing because it basically offered a structured, ordered framework that was like, oh, look how pristine things were before it was touched by Christianity. And Christianity is what brought in all this awful color and texture and actually diversity, right, into the classical project, right? And so anyway, so this is the way that they were thinking about it at this time. And so looking back at the classical period, they said, well, they had the Aeneid, they had the Iliad and the Odyssey. So if we're going to create a Finnish national identity, then what we need is a Finnish epic. And so I'm just using this as an example because it's probably my favorite from this period. There's a guy named Elias Lönnrot who went around and basically collected all the old Finnish songs about the sort of like the ancient heroes and the creation of the world. And, a lot of this stuff only survived in folklore, right? So he goes around and he collects the songs from all these people who, can't read, they can't write, but they have hours and hours and hours of poetry just memorized off the top of their head. And he collects all that stuff together, and then he synthesizes it into a single epic work called the Kalevala. Now, there was never any such thing in like medieval Finland. It's a made up epic. It's made up of real parts, but it was created, it was synthesized. It's, by the way, extremely dope, very beautiful. It's been like one of the most, I think actually, especially in my young life, but even now, like one of the most influential pieces of poetry that I've ever read. So I do recommend it. It's awesome. And it there were parts of it that also had a huge influence on a lot of Tolkien's development, because it was really, I mean, it was just being translated to English when Tolkien was a kid.
Oh yeah,
that was like, it was a big deal. But you've got other examples of the search for the national epic. Beowulf is my favorite. The only reason we know about Beowulf, the only reason the manuscript isn't moldering somewhere in a library totally forgotten, is because when they found it, a lot of people started saying, oh well, maybe this is our national epic. And so they would say, oh well, maybe Beowulf, maybe it started out with the Danes. Oh, it's the Danish national epic because a bunch of the characters in it are Danes. There's a Danish king in here, right? And then the Germans said, no, it's a German national epic because it's written in Anglo-Saxon, which is a West Germanic language, and so is German. So this is a German national epic. And not until like almost a century later did the English come along and say, well, actually it was written in English. So, but there are no English characters in the story, right? So it doesn't really qualify.
It's
not anybody's.
It's complicated.
It's just not a national epic. It doesn't fit the bill, but a lot of people wanted it to be, and so that's how it kind of rose to prominence. Obviously, you've got like probably the actual German national epic, right? The Nibelungenlied, which Wagner's whole Ring cycle is built off of that. The sagas of the Icelanders, which altogether, for the Icelandic people, that's their Shakespeare. And obviously, the Cid. For people on the Iberian Peninsula, and I know at one point the Song of Roland was supposed to be the French national epic.
But it's such a strange story to be a national epic, because it's a story of defeat and it's like,
well, defeat is okay. Lost causes are actually some of the best, most successful national epics, but it's, I don't know, it doesn't seem to fit the bill for what France is now. I was thinking about this earlier. Obviously, you're closer to French culture than I am, but if I had to pick something that now is maybe like the great French national epic, it might be something like Les Mis.
Yeah, that's what I thought when you were talking. Yeah, because
I would sort of guess that's
in the revolutionary mode, it's something that seems to function as something like that.
And it's got the right kind of scale, but it's also like a deeply humane work in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and it's not as mythological, like because they are a modern nation.
And then, of course, when it comes to the Celts, like the Scottish, Irish, Manx, Welsh, like when it comes to the Celtic people, you have so many national epics, it would be hard to even pick one. They're sort of the people that like legitimately just had all the stuff like right there for them, because basically Celtic history is just an extremely long history of lost causes and heroes, like all the way from ancient times and like the Táin all the way up to like Bonnie Prince Charlie and all that stuff, which has a like his whole story has this kind of mythic flavor to it, despite the fact that it's happened relatively recently, historically speaking. So what all of these things have in common, right, is that they're things that for something to be really effective as a national epic, typically speaking, it's got to belong to a mythic past. So this is part of why it's very difficult to speak of like what would be the American national epic, or I assume the Canadian national epic, though.
Yeah, the thing about that is that the French Canadians have access to a national epic, but they basically don't want anything to do with it because it's so Catholic. The story of the early settlers who came and died and were kidnapped by natives and tortured like it's really beautiful and intense, and some of the early, like Samuel de Champlain was an astounding character. It's just that he was so Catholic and so Christian that people don't talk, they just can't hold it in them to tell that story.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd be really hard put to like to
to say like what's the national epic for America, but again, I think probably America's just too large. Like you have to think of it in terms of regional epics, and a lot of our big regional stories, obviously, a lot of the big regional stories of the American Southwest also deeply Catholic stories.
Yeah.
And of course, American culture as a whole is extremely anti-Catholic. There is you know, the thing, you know, like I can't, you can barely even talk about this on the internet right now, but or even in, you know, polite company, but something like Gone with the Wind, right, the film, right, is very, very close to like something like a regional epic for the Deep South, which is not quite the region I live in, but it's pretty close. And obviously that is, you know, that story, you know, for good or for ill, it's got to be discarded now, you know. And obviously there are problems with it, but also, you know, a lot of people found it to be a really beautiful and compelling story. So, but you know, but there is something like the Wild West, the antebellum South.
Yeah, the Wild West has definitely its mythology that is a real mythology.
Yeah,
the Wild West is a real mythology that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, so there is something like mythological time, and what I'll be really interested to see is, you know, well, who knows what's going to happen, you know, the next 200-300 years, but you know, a few hundred years on, like what's our mythical past going to be?
It's great that you're hopeful that America will last that long.
I'm an extremely optimistic person. I don't know what to tell you.
Sorry to be so. It's just so many crazy things are happening right now.
No, I mean it's a wild, wacky time. Like I have no idea what's going to happen. But I am a very optimistic person, so that's one thing.
So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
So how do you see? So let's say now, you know, we're kind of thinking about this and this rediscovery of stories, rediscovery of legends.
Yeah.
You know, do you think that there are ways for us to? Because there are, in these national epics are beautiful and powerful, but like you said, there are some ways in which, for example, Wagner is almost demonized because of the way that the Nazis use Wagner, right?
Right.
But the mythical elements of the story are powerful and could be very useful today. Do you think there are ways that we can recapture, kind of rethread some of these elements together to maybe rediscover this more fractal relationship, you know, that used to be the ancient way of thinking?
I mean, yes, I think, and I not only do I think it can be done, I think it's got to be done.
Yeah.
Because I mean, there are a lot of like great, like there's a whole genre of novel called like the Southern Gothic novel, right? That's really built around the romance and the trauma of the Southern United States, right? So, but basically it was just built out of people like trying to work through this stuff by telling stories about it. And I think that I mean, Wagner's Ring Cycle, for instance, has already been extremely successfully retold in the Star Wars franchise.
Yeah.
You know, like the first 3 Star Wars films are Wagner, right?
Yeah.
It's like operatic in its scope. It's got the same like use of light and darkness, everything else. The whole idea of the son replacing the father, right? The son has to kill the father in order to ascend, right? That whole idea, right? Super Wagnerian theme. So I think, but I think that yes, these stories have to be retold, and we can retell them in a way where we're also kind of honest about, you know, there's got to be a way, and I know you've done videos about this, but I'll just say there's got to be a way to both love your ancestors and also be honest about their sins.
Yeah.
There's got to be a way to do that. And right now it seems like we can only do one or the other.
But that's actually a function of idolatry. It's an image of idolatry, because one of the things that happens is that because we don't have the fractal relationship, because we don't have this hierarchy that leads all the way up to God, we actually expect of these lower rungs to be perfect. And if they're not perfect, we hate them because they're not perfect. And so there's a sense in which if things were properly laid out and we don't treat these figures as idols to worship them or to cast them down, either way, that we see them as just manifestations that are gray because they're not God. You know, that all these leaders, all these heroes have dark sides. Obviously, there's no way around that.
Right. Yeah.
Then we could celebrate their heroism and also recognize their sins, like, you know, and in some ways, you know, I think that the idea to cover their sins to some extent, in the sense that, we want to emphasize the positive because we want them to be examples in their good things towards us. Like, what's the point of just pointing out all the evils of the people that came before you? What you want are examples. But if you can't find examples, then how can you get better? Like, how can you even live up to the beautiful aspects of what has been given to you?
Yeah.
He's like,
I don't know.
How do we do that now?
I'm trying to solve the world's problems right now, but
well, we need to do it first of all by telling good stories. Like, that's how we need to do it.
But that's how this starts. So just a couple more things about the national epic, and then I'll segue into some telling good story stuff, hopefully.
Yeah.
So all of these things, let's say, when we go back and we talk about, Beowulf or the Kalevala or the ring cycle or something, all of these things have the capacity to be nested into the Christian story, right? Not just historically, but still now, right? Like this, elites don't want you to know this, but storytelling is free. You can just tell stories, right? But if you don't do this, I mean, this is the problem, right? This is why things got really murdery in the last century, right? Is that if you don't nest them and you try to put on, I think idolatry is exactly the right language for it. If you try to put more weight on them than they can bear, then they start to develop some problems. First of all, they're just, for one thing, just insufficiently universalizing, right? So, like, what do you do if you're trying to tell a story about German people living in this country we made up called Germany? Well, now what do I do with all the people who aren't German, right? Turns out the answers to that question were pretty ugly, right? One step in, but the other thing is that there's still a step in the downward fragmentation of identity, right? These stories were not enough to hold identity together over the long run.
That's right. And that's important because it's now we can see patently that is true.
Yeah.
Right. It's like maybe when those stories were cast and when these national identities were cast, you could have prophesized it and people could have believed you or not believed you. But now, as we notice, everything turned to mush. We realize that no, those stories, these national identities, even here in Quebec, it's like a very short, concentrated time.
Yeah.
It's like we went from the 1940s, 50s as the most Catholic place in the world to the 1970s with this major nationalist movement to basically the 2000s where all of that doesn't matter anymore and we're all just global mush.
I mean,
pretty fast.
Here in the US, especially like growing up, very like conservative fundamentalist, right? We had the founding fathers, right? We didn't have any saints, but we had the founding fathers, right? George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, all those dudes, right? And there was a lot of work expended in trying to really build up a kind of a Christian mythology around them, even though many of them were not Christians, many of them, universalists, atheists, deists, etc. But there was a lot of work put into trying to basically build up a mythology around that as, well, if we could just get back to these guys, then America would be what it's supposed to be, right? And just as a story, it's not strong enough. It doesn't have the capacity to confer identity. Like, what do you do with people who don't fit into the story? Or what, I mean,
even in your own, like, whatever Declaration of Independence, like, who are the not people? And we the people.
All men are created equal. Women, slaves, that's a different thing. But men, I mean, and I'm not just here to like rag on my country. The country that I live in. But my point is that story itself is actually great, right? Those men actually lived, flawed human beings or whatever, but actually lived interesting lives and did courageous things. And it's not wrong to love them or praise them. But if you try to put on them the weight of the whole American story, it's too much. It's too much. They can't hold it, right? So the other thing is that very often this kind of story, one of the deep flaws that it often has is that very often this kind of story is not participatory. Right? There's really like Now this differs. I mean, a lot of if you're really into American history, there's a lot of pretty cool participatory things. You can go to the East Coast, and do. You can go to, Washington's farm, and like they have like a bourbon night there once a year. And think like, okay. I mean, there's a really cool place called Colonial Williamsburg where everybody's like dressed up in period costume and they try to stay in character, and that's all fun. So like there are some ways you can participate in the stuff, but ultimately it's not very participatory, right? And then like, well, okay, but what if you're Black? How do you participate in Colonial Williamsburg, right? So there's like different. There's just is one of the problems with this kind of story is that for a story to really confer identity, it's got to be something that you can actually participate in. You can make it a part of your life. So it's happening. James Taylor talks about this. I mean, for Orthodox Christians, this will be a really familiar concept, but James Taylor in A Secular Age, he talks about this idea of, kairotic time, the idea that this moment that's maybe a mythical moment or something that happened 2,000 years ago becomes closer than yesterday, right? That's what happens at Pascha, is that at Pascha, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, a historical event, a mythical event, all these layers to it. But on Pascha night, on Easter night, it becomes closer than yesterday.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of, and so most of these stories don't have the capacity to do that. And when you see people,
or at least not completely, they have
not
relative capacity to do that.
Yeah.
Like you can celebrate the 4th of July or whatever. There are things.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough.
But like you said, they just, if they try to stand on their own as the totalizing identity, they end up being dangerous. Actually.
Yeah. And then of course, I mean, one of the questions we've been dancing around for a long time is, and then what if you're a brand new country, right? Well, what is your mythic time, right? And I think we've kind of addressed that.
Yeah.
So let me give just like a couple of like practical applications for people. It's the Baptist preacher in me. I can't totally get away from it. But also it's a couple of practical applications, but then also a little bit about the project that I've been working on and why it's tied into all of this. So if you wanted to like come at all of this stuff and you're trying to figure out like, what do I do with it? Well, what do I do with this universal history stuff? It's very fun to like, how do I actually participate in this and integrate this into my life? The first thing that I'd say is for you as a Christian, the liturgical year is your epic. It's your sacred story. It's one that you can totally participate in. We have this prayer in the evening, or as part of our evening prayers in the Orthodox Church. It comes from the service of Compline, and it's addressed to the Mother of God. And I'm not going to unpack this or defend this for our Protestant friends out there. Please understand, we mean something by this that's maybe not. Well, anyway, don't freak out. I'll be happy to explain this sometime later. But we have in this prayer, we say, you are the salvation of the race of Christians. Now, salvation, we mean like a lot more things by salvation than, like
than dying and going to heaven.
Than dying and going to heaven. So that's not what we're talking. But she's the salvation of the race of Christians. In what way? Because Christ comes from her, right? And in that sense, every single Christian is descended from and is a child of Mary.
Yeah.
Right. But the thing to kind of focus in on there is actually that last bit, the generation or the race of Christians, that when you pass through the baptismal font, you become something more than just your, this is why St. Paul, this is why the church can simultaneously, we can talk about there's no Jew, Greek, bond, free, male, female, but then also preserve distinctions between those things in important ways.
Yeah.
We can do both because of this, right? And this is why, I mean, it's tied back to my long running theory, right? That you're not really a Christian country until you have like a definitive national icon of the Mother of God. That's when you become a Christian people, right? Is because there's some connection between her and the incarnation, some connection between her,
between the land, between the notion of
between all those
the
things.
Body, right? It's all these things that are there. You know, the that which holds, right? It's like that's in some of the motherland, or however you want to think about it. All these ways of describing it.
So then, and I'll say this especially to my like fellow Orthodox converts, right? Is that just sort of understand and accept. You've received a faith which is, like Syrio, Greco, Jewish in its origins, right? Like all the early writers, right? All the early hymns, all these different things. They're not written by people from America, right? So you're receiving this. I know it. listen, that's a dumb thing to say, but also it's like weirdly freeing to realize that. So just like realize that you're receiving this faith that's so much older than you, and that wasn't made with your tastes in mind. And when people get like really like, let's say, agitated about how, well, when are we going to enculturate? When are we going to have like a single American jurisdiction? When are we going to have, like American culture really represented? And what about the music and all that stuff? Like just like settle down.
Yeah.
Settle down and accept the faith that you've been given, but know that by doing so, by just like faithfully saying your prayers, going to the services, participating as fully in the life of your parish as you can, that you're not just hopefully participating in the salvation of your own soul, but you're also participating in the salvation of your ancestors and of your culture. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to fully accept and receive this deposit of tradition if enculturation is ever going to happen in a natural way.
Yeah.
It's just like we were talking about. Committees can't do it. It won't stick. It's got to naturally arise.
It's got to just arise out of all kinds of things that we won't be able to describe afterwards.
So that in 500 years, when the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Texas has officially replaced hummus with guacamole as the Lenten dip of choice, but just like
nobody will remember how it happened.
Nobody will remember, but like
the way we do things.
In 500 years, we'll have American Orthodoxy, for good or for ill. It'll exist, right? And but we're not going to get there by like just trying to force things. So anyway, so save your family, cultivate just kind of a normal holy life, and wait a few hundred years and see what happens. But so all of that with that graceful segue, just real quick here, I know the video's kind of gone long, but just to talk a little bit about the project, right? So it's on Kickstarter right now. There'll be a link down below where you can click to it and go. I would love it if you would go and consider backing, even just like a couple of bucks to watch the project or whatever. If we get enough people backing, then it kind of like favors it in the algorithm, and then Kickstarter will start promoting itself and it'll have a much larger reach. But just to say something about this project, why is this a thing that I'm doing? Why is this really important or significant? What's it have to do with the symbolic world and symbolism and all this stuff? When I was growing up, I was part of a, came out of just extremely fundamentalist conservative American Christianity, in the Deep South, all that stuff. So growing up in that, but also growing up alongside a Chinese culture, because we came from a missionary family and they adopted, and so a lot of like Chinese relatives and things like this, and like the food that I grew up mainly eating was like Chinese food. So like for me, that's nostalgia. That's mom's cooking, right? Is Chinese. And because she grew up over there, and a lot of her siblings, she has Chinese siblings and everything else. So I kind of grew up like in this one culture, but also right next door to this other culture. And I mean, to the point that Mandarin was my second language as a child, and so I grew up right next door to this other culture that was actually really rich and old, and had a sense of its own aesthetic, right? A sense of philosophy, a sense of aesthetic, a sense of storytelling, and a certain mode of expressing things. And this is like bright and colorful. And then the thing that is, the lane that I'm in is just like very beige. I mean, literally beige. I mean, aggressively, we chose to like make our churches beige as a color.
That's right.
Like, why? But anyway, and so trying to wrestle with that as a young person is how this project was birthed. And it started out as trying to answer the question, well, what does it take? What do you need to have a culture? And so when I was young, I started reading Beowulf and the Song of Rohlin first, and then like a lot of the other epics, medieval epics. And I became totally in love with this idea of the epic and the national epic and all this different stuff. I hadn't, I was like 10 or something at the time, so I hadn't really connected the dots on like, where some of the stuff ended up leading.
If that's what you were reading at 10, we'll forgive you, Richard.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I just fell totally in love with this stuff, and so, and later on, as my literary powers grew, I began to basically attempt to compose a national epic, like do what Tolkien did, but Tolkien did it mainly linguistically at first. And I am a linguist, so there is a lot of that in here, but I was mainly focused on the idea of like what would be the story that could be then passed on, like that people would get their identity from. And then as I grew older, I came to understand more and more that it's not enough just to have a story, but that you actually need a sacred story, and you need like a sort of a sacred participatory narrative. And so I kind of went from there to developing, to doing these kind of what if questions. Tolkien and Lewis especially famously used to talk about this, that when he was writing, the Narnia stories, he really just started out with like a what if. Well, what if I change this one thing, right? And so for me, my what if question was like, what would a Psalter be like in a fantasy world?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how would you, like, if if God is still the God of the fantasy world, but the Christian religion, the incarnation hasn't happened, the Christian religion doesn't exist, but like, like what would that look like? How would that play out? And so like how do you make a like a fantasy religion that's still true, it's not idolatrous, it's not demonic, etc., but also you're not just like doing fantasy Christianity, which is, in my opinion, is actually worse. It's actually worse. Anyway, so I started developing and kind of tinkering with these things, and then the histories and the poetry and everything else kind of developed into this much larger mythic cycle. And in a nutshell, all the stuff that I've shared with you today, and all the stuff that we've shared over the last 2 years of our Symbolic World Universal History conversations, is stuff that I originally worked out by doing this.
Mm-hmm.
I'd go read like an Irish story, or I'd go read the Kalevala, and then I would try to figure out what that story was about by writing a story like that.
Mm-hmm.
So like working out my ideas, but trying to work them out in this creative way, because for me, the creative always has to come before the analytical. And so as for why it's a tabletop role-playing game, like I said, I'm going to do another video soon with Father Deacon Nicholas Kotar, where we talk about that particular medium. But basically, the short version is, I think it's a powerful and very overlooked storytelling medium. There are a lot of it's almost the only thing left. It's almost the only means left that has of telling a story that's not totally controlled by Hollywood and by the big five publishing companies and or big three or whatever it is now. But just like there's a stranglehold on storytelling. And like to ever get back to where we could even make a good Christian film, we've got to first learn how to go all the way back and just like tell stories around the campfire together.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to phrase it. It's almost like a kind of laboratory of storytelling. It's like sitting around and learning what stories are made of, and then people recognizing as they watch people make decisions in the story, like watching what the results of that are, because they have real kind of consequences. Right. I think if you phrase it that way, I mean, I don't see how anybody could object, because we don't know how to tell stories anymore.
And this is the great thing, is that as a storytelling medium, it's participatory, right? Which is the whole reason it's a role-playing game, is because I've been working on this stuff for years. And one day, a good friend of mine was like, "Hey, would you just run a game for us set in?" Because I've been doing a Tolkien game for a long time. Would you just run a game for us set in this world that you've been working on? Because I would like to know more about it. But it's kind of, poetry is pretty inaccessible to a lot of people, etc. And so we just started doing that, and then it kind of spun out from there.
Wow.
But what I would encourage people is, if this sounds cool to you and you're not freaked out by it, maybe go back to Project, check it out. But also to encourage everyone that we need to be telling these stories. Like it's weird. Like lately, I know a lot of people like you, but also other friends who are trying to get films off the ground and things like this, where we've been talking for years and years about, okay, as Orthodox Christians, as traditional Christians, etc., we need to get out there, we need to start telling stories and making movies and things like this. And we're the people with the most beautiful tradition, so let's share that with the world, etc. And then as soon as like people start trying to work on these projects and get people to fund them, like everybody just kind of dries up, and they're like, "Oh, I don't know about this fiction thing, and I'm not sure about this. What about this little detail?" And and like people suddenly get really cold feet. They get really, really nervous. And I want to encourage people to boldness. And of course, yes, we're going to make missteps. I'm going to make some, you're going to make some, but well, we have to do this because because at the end of the day, this deep fragmentation of identity has come down to now where we have multiple identities warring within ourselves for who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to be and what our body should look like and everything else. And if we don't have some, if we can't return to a narrative framework that at least offers, we don't have an emperor, we can't force this on people, but if we don't return people to a narrative framework that at least offers to heal them and reintegrate them into this kind of nested hierarchy, this nested framework that ultimately comes down to Holy Week. Like if we can't offer some people an alternative in that way, then we're letting them down, we're failing them, and we're not really, we won't effectively communicate the gospel, right? The reason Christianity spreads, the reason it takes off when it goes places, is because obviously with some fits and starts and mistakes and everything, but it always finds a way to contain the culture, right? Where you can then be a Russian, or again, Russia also made up country, but you can be a Muscovite, or you can be a Kievite, or you can be from Novgorod, or you can be from Vilnius, or you can be from London, or you can be from Paris, and also a Christian.
Yeah.
And those things nest in on each other. So that's actually secretly, that's what the whole project is about. So I hope people will check it out.
Cool. So remind people, tell them the name and until when they've got to do this. Because
it's called Emboria Role-Playing in the World Under Starlight. It's launching on Kickstarter, hopefully the same day that this recording drops out on YouTube. And I think that it's going to run for a month. So I would encourage people to get out and back it.
All right, everybody, you heard Richard. And so Richard, thanks again. And we'll be paying attention to the Kickstarter, and we'll talk again very soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan.